Hey there, my name's Eli, and today I want to talk about a subject near and dear to my heart, Ball Lightning. This video is less of a build guide and more of a check-in on how this build is going in 3.15. This build has been a staple of mine for a while, so let's dive into some maps and take a look at how it does. We're going to start with a Maze of the Minotaur with no mods that are particularly strong against our build. To give you an idea of the defensive layers, we have 40% mind over matter, so 40% damage gets taken from mana first, and we have around 8.8 thousand mana right now. We also use Arcane Cloak, so this is actually a pretty big deal. When we have Arcane Cloak up at max effectiveness, we have around 5600 damage shield for almost 7 seconds. It has a cooldown of 3.3 seconds, so there are little windows where we're a little bit more vulnerable than normal, and this can matter if we're fighting bosses that have really big hits. On top of this, we have our base dodge and spell dodge at 60 and 50% respectively, and if we've been hit recently, we get 5% extra, so that brings us to 65-55. And then if we get hit by a spell, we get another 8% from the enchant on our boots. So at full effect, we have 65-63 dodge. Now let's take a look at this Minotaur fight. As you can see, when I run out of my Arcane Cloak, I get a little bit more skittish. I try to dodge around a little bit, but when I do have it, I am perfectly willing to stand under rocks, or even try to tank hits from the Minotaur. Pretty seamless fight overall for the Minotaur. With such high dodge chance, it really mitigates a lot of the potential one-shot and chunking mechanics like the falling rocks and his big slams. For him to be a really big threat, we have to not have our Arcane Cloak up. But if we take care and manage that, he's really not a big deal. Now on the other end, let's take a look at Pit of Chimera. This boss is generally speaking much better because he attacks a lot faster and more often. And on this particular map, we are double cursed. The Chimera and all monsters are faster. They gain power charges, and if you don't know, power charges for monsters are very effective, so they're going to crit a lot more often, relatively speaking. We have less effect on our conductivity curse, and we don't regenerate at all. So we are fully at the mercy of the timing on our mana flask and our gloves to prevent us from spending mana. As you can see, while we're running through the map, all of these mods don't really mean a whole lot, and I'll get to why in particular. The double curses don't really affect us. But also you notice the build is still pretty smooth overall, even though we aren't regenerating any mana. This is partially because running your mana flask over and over and over consistently throughout a map is pretty standard play mechanically for how this build works. So we're pretty often getting full refills on our mana, but we're also getting a percentage of our mana back on kill, which helps, and our gloves are giving us a nearly 30% chance to not spend mana when we cast. And because as an Archmage build we are using our mana pool for both offense and defense, that's a pretty big deal. Alright, let's take a look at the Chimera fight. As you can see, we're preloading our mana flask so we can get set up and make sure that we have a topped off mana bar, and the first phase goes pretty well. We get some of our mana flask charges back from the monsters in between phases, and we almost die. As you can see, the unique snake's attack lands just as we lose our Arcane Cloak shield. So this gives you an idea of just how strong that is. Then we take a big chunk again without our mana shield, and then again without Arcane Cloak up. Even though it was a small amount, it was a 2000 shield, it dissipated, and he managed to land some hits. So our Arcane Cloak defensive layer was down, and he got through our fairly substantially high dodge chance. And then on this death, even with our Arcane Cloak up and a full mana bar, we still took a few hits. He got through our dodge and just chunked us down. This is the nature of playing a dodge-based build. Sometimes monsters are just going to land attacks. And I'm showing you these deaths because it's important to highlight about this build that you are not invincible, even though you are very strong, especially mapping, because of the greater multiple projectiles and how Ball Lightning works mechanically. It's a super strong skill for mapping, and the build is very tough and can take some pretty heavy hits. That doesn't mean it can just sit and tank bosses like the Chimera that are super buffed. Now that said, as we're watching these other phases, you can see the build is pretty strong. We do phase him fairly quickly, And most of the time, our dodge chance and our cloak do hold up and take care of us. And keep in mind, we are taking extra damage from vulnerability, and the Chimera is a lot faster, and we're dealing less damage. Not to mention, we have no regeneration. The no regeneration part is kind of a bummer because we do walk around with about 1100 mana regen. And when we activate our Arcane Cloak for about 8 seconds afterwards, we have between 1250 and 1300 regen. This really helps refill our health bar with the Agnostic, and so without any regen at all, Agnostic becomes way less powerful, potentially. Now let's just watch a little bit of Hydra gameplay. This is a map with double damage as lightning and double damage as fire, but no other important mods. All of these fights are of course with the Maven watching as well. But as you can see, we can dodge some hits, we can tank some hits, and we do fairly decent damage to the Hydra herself. The fight's not really a big deal. And to cap off the gameplay review section, let's take a look at the Formed, where we have Ellie weakness, and they gain power charges, and they ignite. This fight takes a few minutes overall for this character to complete, so I'm going to kind of skip through and show highlights in the background while I'm talking, and talk a little bit about what the struggle was here. So because we are a Pathfinder and Inquisitor, we're an Ascendant, a Scion, we do gain a ton of flash charges and all that jazz. So even in elongated fights like this, we still do get a fair amount of mana charges. And as you can see here, we are still susceptible to Minotaurs flying up from underneath the ground. I actually didn't see him coming, which is why I didn't evade that physically. But for the rest of the fight, take note of where he is and avoid whenever he's going to pop up. But yeah, like I was saying, for the most part, the build maintains its flash charges over time, which is really nice because we need mana to live and to kill stuff. And because we deal a fair bit of damage, we are dealing enough to gain flash charges, which then get amplified by our increased flash charges gained. Basically what this means is we can take elongated fights. We did die once on this particular fight, but had I been paying attention and watching for the Minotaur, I don't think we would have really taken much damage at all. Alright, let's go over the path of building. I'm going to try to make this as fast as possible to give you a really good sense of how the character levels and where our damage spikes come from. First things first, we are a Scion Ascendant, so passive skills are really important. As you're leveling up, this tree is going to change. It wouldn't be strange to take extra spell damage nodes, maybe even cast speed nodes here to start off as crit, and maybe even come down here into the Templar area to get more damage nodes and life nodes. So don't be afraid to move around and get some of these life nodes and mix and match getting damage where you need to, but understanding this is where roughly we're going to end up. And again, because we are Scion Ascendant, it is really important that we get all 4 of our Ascendancies, because grabbing our Inquisitor sub-Ascendancy and getting the Path of the Ranger are both really important. So you have to make a choice at your Merciless Ascendancy which one you want to get, and it sucks because both are really impactful. Now let's take a quick look at the configuration so you can get a sense of where these damage numbers are coming from. This number is against Cirrus with slower projectiles on. We have a 12% shock, which is reasonable to get against him. We have 2 stages on Sigil of Power. This isn't really a huge amount of damage. Even at max, it's like 40,000 damage difference. We have probably spent around 5,000 mana, probably more, recently. And nothing else here is really that crazy. As for items, let's hop into the game real quick and take a look. The big get that we need for this build is a 6-link Pledge of Hands. And as of right this moment, that's only about 4x, maybe 3 if that guy is actually legitimately selling. So right now, not too expensive. Earlier on in the league, they're more like 6 to 7. So they are kind of expensive. And most of these other pieces are going to be anywhere between 10 chaos and maybe 100 for the gloves or belt. The gloves and belt, and I suppose the ring, are your most expensive potentially, depending on how you want to get and what resistances you need. So for example, these gloves, the mana, as you can see, isn't that great. Tier 7 base mana, as well as a hybrid to make it kind of usable. The thing is, it's triple resist, and it has life. These gloves don't otherwise exist on the market, triple resist like this. So it kind of depends. You have to really mix and match the ring, one of your ring slots, the belt, and the gloves are your big sources of being able to manage your resistances, which isn't really a lot of slots to do that, which is why on our tree here, we do pick up a couple extra nodes for resistance. At some point, we will also take this jewel socket, but for now, it's important to fix those resists. Other than that, as you can see, Edziri's Foible, Crown of the Immortal Eye, Cloak of Defiance doesn't have to be 6 linked, so this is pretty cheap. You really just want the highest stats you can get. Obviously, you want the enchant that gives quality to mana, and on the staff here, we want the enchant that gives quality to elemental damage. If you want it, if you have time, if you want to use TFT to actually get that enchant, because you're never going to find it with Harvest. And Omayokin, I like the dodge enchant. That's my jam. Some people will get the mana regen, but I believe that was nerfed in 3.15, so to me the only obvious choice is to get dodge because we need to not take hits. And 8% spell dodge is a ton. Now as for our flasks, and these are important because we're going to have them up most of the time, Aquamarine is actually really strong. The Chilled Ground is very powerful as an extra minor defensive layer. And because we're using Elemental Overload, I picked up one that gives us chance to shock, so we are more consistently shocking stuff. Moving on, Quicksilver Flask is still really important. I even think the Adrenaline mod, even though it's been nerfed to hell, is still important, especially on this build because we get a lot of increased charges gained, but we also get increased effect of our flasks. So any mod that we can get that increases, so in this case 46 base, is more like 60%. Maybe a little bit more with our increased effect. And for our silver flask, really important, we want as much cast speed as we can because cast speed was also nerfed, so this really helps us get closer to where we were in 3.14 and before that. And our Corundum flask, which is, in my opinion, one of the unsung heroes. This flask is currently doing 2 things. Right now, it helps fix resists against maps that have elemental weakness to make certain that we are capped. And it's also making it so we don't get stunned. I don't have to worry about getting like Unwavering Stance or Skyforth or some other way to fix stun immunity. It's all right here in a flask. And because we get so many extra flask charges, we have this up pretty much whenever we want. So stun immunity in a flask, pretty strong. And of course our Foreboding Eternal Mana Flask of Staunching. This is really good. So why this is so good, we are getting rid of Corrupted Blood, yes, but whenever we use a mana flask, we are getting rid of an elemental ailment because of our essence extraction. And whenever we use a mana flask, we are getting Numbing Elixir, which is 40% reduced effect of curses. And because of this, we care a lot less about curses on our maps. Another defensive layer worth mentioning from one of our cluster jewels here is every time we use an elemental skill like Ball Lightning or any of our skills, we have a chance to blind enemies, which is a pretty strong defensive layer as well. Now, what are our big upgrades from this point? Let's hop back into Path of Building real quick. One thing I wanted to point out too is if enemies are nearby, they take 10% more elemental damage, so you can add on another 55,000 damage right here. And for our next major upgrade, we are going to want to put in something like this for Wish for Death and Master of Fear. So if we have Unnerved, we can go over here and say enemies are unnerved. That's pretty significant. And we also get Culling Strike DPS. And eventually we can put in another of these Scintillating Idea Jewels, which would bring us up to a combined DPS with Culling Strike, effectively 700k versus Cirrus. Add on another 10% from them being nearby, so you have around 770,000 effective DPS. So essentially from here, we can still get about 50% more damage. But again, this is, as you can see, level 98. This is a level-intensive build. It wants passive points. And that's really it. In terms of gameplay, you want to make sure you have your Arcane Cloak damage shield up as much as it can be. So you want to have a full mana pool when you can. And it's been doing really well. Everything that I've thrown at it that I've wanted to do in terms of endgame content it's been able to handle still, even despite all the nerfs. It more or less plays the same way. As you might have noticed, the previous incarnation of this build, the more popular version, is a crit-based version, but because of the gutting of our lucky crit chance, I decided to just go with flat elemental overload damage and avoid crit. This kind of sucks because in the crit version you get a cluster jewel that knocks enemies back on lightning critical strikes. This is actually really, really powerful as a defensive layer, so it sucks to not have that. That said, this build does tons of damage and it can withstand pretty heavy hits. So with that in mind, I'm going to go search out my next new build. If you've been running a crit version of this build or you have a better setup, shoot me the POB. I would love to see it because I'm always looking to improve on builds and min-max and all that good stuff. And if you want to see more content like this, hit like, hit subscribe, throw me a comment, tell me what you think. I also have a Discord. Feel free to come in, ask any question you want. We're all very helpful. Until next time, this is Eli, signing off.